Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. For today's episode, I'm joined by Vox's Zack Beauchamp to discuss his new book, The Reactionary Spirit, How America's Most Insidious Political Tradition Swept the World. This episode is all about the state of global democracy in the United States, India, in Europe, the UK, all across the world, where we're seeing this real contest between the forces of liberalism and illiberalism. Really interesting book and interesting conversation. We hit a bunch of different points, everything from the state of the two parties to campaign finance and everything in between. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation supporting the work of this podcast. Zack Beauchamp, welcome to the Realignment.
Hey, I'm so happy to be here. This is going to be really fun.
Pumped to chat with you. I think this is a great time for the book to come out because we can do both the day-to-day political analysis that you do for your day job at Vox, but also really bring the themes of our moment into the actual book itself. So I want to start by quoting from two different pieces of work, the first of which is your book. So at the top of your book jacket, you say, to save democracy in America and around the world, we need to understand the real source of the threat, the reactionary spirit. A lot of folks are going to hear that and very much place your book and your work in this Trump moment sense. The other thing I'd like to read from and then just get your reaction from is the Washington Post put out a really interesting poll about a month ago that found that swing state voters who prioritize democracy, quote unquote democracy in a broad sense, actually, in certain polls, say that Donald Trump is a better preserver of democracy than Joe Biden. We can get into the discussion of how is the poll conducted? What are people really saying there? But I just like this compare contrast of that poll and the way you frame this work, because it gets at the central reaction I had during this entire reading of the book, which was, it's unclear what we're talking about when it comes to democracy and preservation. So could you kind of react to that poll within the framework that you're putting forward with this book?
Yeah. So I think this actually speaks to one of the central motivations that I had for writing the book, because I think one of the most unremarked upon elements of our current political moment is that everybody uses the language of democracy, right? It doesn't matter which side you are on, right? Even to a certain extent, some avowedly non-democratic regimes employ democratic language or democratic concepts in trying to justify what they're doing. And that is just, it remains in that way. We're still in the end of history moment ideologically. We all talk within democracy's confines. We use its language. We use its concepts. We say things like, I believe in the right for the people to speak for themselves. You would never say, even if you're, the most authoritarian politician operating inside a democratic context, and there are some examples in the book, right? Like Viktor Orban in Hungary, just doesn't say, I'm toppling democracy, democracy's over, right? The language is very different. So when people say that they're supporting democracy, right, or that they're, about voters who care about democracy are more likely to vote for Trump, it raises the question that you suggested, in your question, which is what really is democracy and what do we mean when we talk about democracy, and who is able to present themselves as standing for democracy. And the argument that I make in the book is that has become unmoored from people from who actually does stand for what we would really classically define as core democratic principles, or even the functioning of the democratic system itself on a very basic minimalist level, of supporting fair elections. That has become unmoored from the rhetoric of defending democracy. So part of my goal in writing the book was to clarify when pro-democratic rhetoric is in fact actually pro-democratic.
Really well stated. And I think this also gets to something I want to make very clear when you made reference to how the fact that everyone speaks as if they're a Democrat, Democrat in the lowercase sense, that's a real Americanly exceptionalist idea. You point out that if you look at really the fascists and the authoritarians in the 20s and 30s, they did not speak in this way. Hitler, Mussolini, various other fascist regimes at the time did not basically use democratic language to express their ideas. So when you refer to basically this end of history idea that democratic language won out, talk more about what you're really speaking about here, especially post-90s.
Yeah. So democracy is so taken for granted by a lot of us now that we forget that it's this relatively recent innovation in human history, right? For the vast bulk of humanity's existence as a people, as far as we know from the historical record, right, we were governed by one form of autocratic regime or another, a monarchy, religious elites, whichever one you want to use. It was just not a leadership that was selected by the people through some kind of electoral or representative process. Right? That's a new innovation, very new, right? As sort of a mass practice, right? Obviously, it existed in Athens, and there was kind of sub-state democracy in different places, local town councils and stuff like that. But what we now understand as democracy was innovated, starting in the United States in the 18th century, right? And so the contest for the soul of the world is a recent one, and democracy only won it really at the end of the 20th century, right? It had to beat monarchy first. It did, when we can date that victory to, it became evident by World War I, but it may have happened earlier, depending on who you talk to. It beat fascism in the mid 20th century, and then it had a long struggle with authoritarian communism, and it won that with the fall of the Soviet Union. And so that narrative, I don't mean this to be triumphalism. Like, look, the good guys are going to win no matter what, right? That's just a description of historical fact, right? A question of which regimes ended up having the most power and the most control over the way that people thought about the things, about the world, and the language that they used to understand their own experience of politics. Right? Yeah, and democracy won that when the Soviet Union fell. It did. And since then, there's just not been a viable successor ideology that has come to replace the core principles of liberal democratic politics.
And what's interesting, too, is you're obviously focused on actual literal constitutional democracies. Israel, the United States, India, Hungary, but even in autocratic regimes today, like you often see Chinese CCP officials argue, well, actually, our regime and the way we actually enact this practice is far more democratic than sort of like the chaotic American system. Putin makes these kind of arguments. It's really easy to dunk on Fukuyama, but if you're actually looking at the intellectual point that he's making, a certain argument which is basically regimes should be judged by which they are capable of stewarding the people and offering representation. That's an argument that was won in a way that was very, very contested in the 20th century, as you said. So let's get to the core of what you argued in your opening statement here. What are, let's say, the broad democratic principles that we should all be able to agree on? And then we'll get to like the left and right edge cases where there's clearly going to be disagreement. Yeah. But it's clear to me from reading this book and just following this space in general that we just lack a shared understanding of what the broad democratic center is. And like when I say center, I don't mean in like Thomas Friedman no label sense, but I mean it literally in, look, like there's this uncontested ground where we all agree this is what democracy looks like. Give off of like your version of those principles.
So I think that the way to capture it, right, in one line is very simply a process by which the leadership of a country is determined by free and fair elections. That's the one line, simple definition of democracy. It's sort of, here I'm most clearly drawing on a political scientist named Anna Przeworski, who's developed this kind of minimalist account of what democracy means. Except it sounds minimalist, right? But it's actually much more complicated than that, because free and fair are pretty big words.
Yeah.
They're doing a lot of work in that definition. And so it's worth unpacking both of them, because I think they mean subtly different things, right? So a free election is one in which the ballots aren't like literally rigged, right? It's not like there's not ballot stuffing. There's not machines that only put out one output. None of that happens, right? The votes are counted as they were cast by the people. And the second component, fair, means the background conditions behind the elections allowed for a meaningful choice. That's a little bit fuzzier, but it means things like if the government owns 100% of the media, and said media is only producing pro-government propaganda and people who criticize the government are thrown in jail, those are not fair conditions for an election. If opposition parties are denied even the smallest amount of funding and the governing party has all of the money to put up advertising anywhere, all of the money to conduct get out the vote operations, that's not a fair election, right? Those are extreme examples, but they're designed to illustrate the case, right? That democracy can't really be democracy without there being a certain set baseline conditions in play to ensure that the election actually is happening on a fair playing field and that people are able to make a reasonable choice, right? Are not just so controlled that they're voting basically based on an incomplete picture of reality, right? And not just incomplete, a one that is deliberately skewed by political authorities and or some state repression. So that I'd say that's what it is. Free and fair elections, but that means a lot of different things have to be in place, right? It means there has to be meaningful freedom of speech, protections for the media, freedom of assembly. A lot of these political rights that often get described as something that are at odds with democracy, right? But they're actually really a core part of it. And it doesn't work. It can't work in the way that it's supposed to be, the way it's supposed to operate as an aggregator of true public opinion without those kinds of things at work.
So many different places I want to go with that. Let's start here. I would love to hear how you think the semi-private nature of the American democratic system presents challenges and difficulties in this category. So, for example, to your point, if the federal government under either Obama or Trump or Joe Biden owned 100% of the news media, by definition, you could just say, hey, like that doesn't meet the fair part of your description. By contrast, though, when you get into semi-private organizations, like let's say Twitter, for example, I could see the right-leaning part of this audience saying, well, when Donald Trump was taken off Twitter and off of social media, that prevented him from expressing himself in the public sphere. That, by definition, means that we didn't have a fair electoral system. But as you and I both know, Twitter, at a very literal level when it comes to Elon Musk's Twitter specifically, is definitely not run by the government. So where does this private versus public distinction come into play?
Yeah, look, it's a really important question and a difficult one, because in a democratic system, you need to be able to give certain leeway to private actors to make decisions about speech. Otherwise, the government's controlling everything, and we're back at the problem that you started at. But at the same time, it's very clear at this point, especially given the consolidation of power under a handful of tech companies, that giving the private sector too much leeway can basically lead to control over information being consolidated by certain actors who don't have the public's interest at heart. Right. So how do you balance that? And that's really a difficult judgment call for different democracies. There are a lot of difficult judgment calls in the practice of making democracy real. Campaign finance is another really good example, right? Like, to a certain extent, you can't just have rich people buying elections by being able to spend unlimited amounts of money on whatever race they want to spend money on. That obviously, in some ways, that can be really damaging. At the same time, if you deny private entities the ability to spend money on campaigns, I mean, think about that as a means of incredible government control over the kinds of information that people are allowed to get. So where do you draw the line? What balance do you strike? These are complex questions, and different countries answer them in different ways. And the reason I'm not being more specific than that is I want to be clear that there's room for legitimate disagreement on these fronts, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and be like, I have the one answer that works for every country in all times under all different systems of private and public ownership that can tell you this is how you have to run a democracy, because no such answer exists, right? That's just not a thing that anyone can dictate from on high. What we can say is that there are certain extreme versions of both of them that are completely unacceptable. Modern Hungary is a really good example, right? Where the private system has been so thoroughly taken over by the government, right? Through intermediaries, friendly oligarchs who get government contracts and things like that, independent media losing revenue from ads that make them uncompetitive due to government regulations, that by one estimate, by about 2017, 90% of the media in the country was under the government's control, or the control of the government's allies. Right. That is a situation where you can say, okay, something has gone badly wrong here. And so while there's a spectrum of legitimate and acceptable democratic practices, I have my opinions about which ones are better. You might have different ones. Members of your audience might have different ones. There are things that are clearly off the spectrum, right? That just like aren't democratic anymore, right? Even if they claim to be. And Hungary is one of those examples.
So then on the Trump and Twitter example, would you say that kicking Trump off of Twitter, one version, or two, the government, and this is where this gets difficult when you get into the specifics,
Yeah.
we somehow pass a law that preserves the speech rights of government officials, aka Trump was kicked off Twitter when he still won the presidency. Would both of those options be within, let's say, this broad middle of democratic practice in your understanding?
I think it would have to depend on how the first thing, the first kind of law that you're describing ends up being worded. Because I've seen versions of that try to be operationalized in places like Texas, right? And it's very clear that the amount of power that they're granting the government over social media companies is utterly antithetical to First Amendment principles, right? So maybe there's a way to make one of those laws work about protecting the rights of public figures to speak on platforms, but it strikes me as being very difficult, at least within the American jurisprudential context, to make that work. Now, the Trump example, was it undemocratic for Twitter to kick him off? I mean, it's worth noting that happened after the election, right?
But he was still president, and that's why but he was at that time still president.
It's just, I'm saying it didn't affect the outcome of the election.
Okay, fair. Right, that's the point there. Yeah.
Yeah, and there were very, very distinct exigent circumstances, which is to say a riot targeting the American Capitol, that maybe make extreme measures more justified by private actors than they would be otherwise. But it just had Twitter said, I don't like what Donald Trump has to say on, let's say, trade, and kicked him off of their platform, or I don't like what Donald Trump has to say on social media regulation and kicked him off of their platform in September 2020, I think that would have been flagrantly undemocratic, right? And do I know what the right legislative remedy is that for? Or is for that? No, I don't exactly know. I know it's not the law that was enacted in Texas, but I don't. There may not even be a good legislative remedy, right? A lot of hard problems don't have good solutions. You just kind of have to muddle through and figure out ways to deal with individual cases of abuses. That's just sometimes the way that law and politics works.
I appreciate your understanding of the nuance there, because there's a certain part of the quote unquote pro-democracy center left to left that was always very aggressive about Twitter not policing Trump more before the election, especially during the May-June 2020 COVID period, various statements, actions he really took. And the inconvenient truth that Twitter just couldn't really articulate properly is, look, he's running for office right now. That's a different circumstance than, let's say, that January period. And just that dichotomy that you established just very made clear the difference here. The question of a politician running for office versus a person who just holds a position on their way out is obviously very, very different here. Something I'm also hyper curious about, I'd like to spend more time on the campaign finance section, because this also gets at the real tension there, because a lot of folks focus on the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court, and they focus on the fact that it enabled super PACs to emerge, all these different ways you could spend a bunch of money. But it should be noted that I think a part of the actual instigation for the Citizens United case was that under McCain-Feingold, there were severe limitations on speech. So, for example, you couldn't, Fahrenheit 9/11 arguably couldn't have been released before the election. There was a specific anti-Hillary Clinton documentary that the government was limiting the publishing of because it was seen as affecting the elections. So, can you talk about the campaign finance angle and just the fact that at a certain point, you pointed out we don't want to live in a system where billionaires are just buying elections left and right. But another way of rephrasing that is, well, what if I, Marshall Kozlov, have opinions and I want to spend money to put up billboards that say my opinion? So I live in Texas. What if I actually think that Texas is undemocratic when it comes to its social media rules? Actually, why don't I have a democratic right to put up a bunch of signs and to spend money on that? To put out a documentary? So can you talk about the tension points there that I think are usually a little too unillustrated and we just look at it through the lens of spending money?
Yeah, no, I think that your example is a good one, right? You should have the right to be able to put up those billboards. It would be wrong for Texas to say you can't put up a billboard protesting our social media policy. And that is a way in which money actually is speech, right? And I think a lot of my fellow liberals can go a little overboard when it comes to campaign finance stuff. Right. I think that they have a sense that money is more determinative in elections than it actually is. A good example is a lot of people recently talking about AIPAC buying the New York congressional seat.
Jamal
right? Like
Bowman.
Jamal Bowman,
Yep.
right? Jamal Bowman, to be clear, was on track according to the polling for the same defeat that he experienced, like by the exact same margin, pretty much.
17, wasn't it 17 points in both the pre-APAC spending polling?
And the after one, like he was going to lose, right? It's not even clear if APAC moved the dial at all on his defeat. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily good that they should be able to invest that much in a race, right? Like there's a distinction between one person buying a billboard and an interest, a particular special interest, however you agree with that special interest or how much you agree with its politics, being able to invest millions and millions of dollars outside the reach of any one individual that no one, absent like, the wealthiest top 0.1% of Americans could ever spend on any one thing, and using that to have a disproportionate impact on the race. Is it as big of a problem as a lot of people make it out to be? No, I think it's somewhat overstated, right? And the benefits of allowing political spending also understated. That doesn't mean there aren't legitimate problems with, especially in local races, right? Where like a corporation might have a really strong interest in continuing to be able to pollute in a specific region, and they can spend so much money on that relative to what any reasonable local politician could spend, that it can have a dramatic impact on the course of that race. So yeah, like I feel like I'm taking this, not just in this conversation, just in general, I'm taking this balancing position that is unsatisfying to people who are on both sides of this relatively heated debate over campaign finance. When I think about actual solutions, I think having a more robust public financing system is a better way to go, right, than what we currently have, one that allows for equal opportunity between candidates. I think reforming election law to allow there to be more third parties. There are a variety of different ways to do that, but proportional representation at the legislative level is a good way to do it. Can solve a lot of these other problems, especially if you pair it with public spending, because it would allow for differential viewpoints to be more expressed, and people to have political parties that are closer to their opinions represented in government, especially when paired with public spending. You would get more of a diversity of opinions broadcast, and people would feel less like the only recourse is for them to, start yelling on Twitter or spend a bunch of money on billboards personally. Not that that's something that people do a lot, right? But it's a lot of the problem here is created by a crisis of representation, where people feel like their views aren't being heard through the political system, and that large and wealthy interests are dictating the course of politics. And so having a system that allows for a more limited degree of public spending, one that's sort of more attainable by ordinary people rather than just organized special interests, but while also devoting more public resources to encouraging a greater set of views, right, reflecting the actual diversity of American public opinion more closely, I think would address a lot of the problems created by our current political situation, which necessitates this weird and uncomfortable dance between infringing on free speech and allowing for oligarchical interventions in elections.
The next angle in the American system, at least, there are tensions between the public and the private sphere, would be the political parties themselves, right? So one of the big huge debates that's happening right now within the Democratic Party when it comes to debating whether or not Joe Biden should continue to seek the presidency is this debate over how democratic was the Democratic primary race that went on from 2023 to 2024. So the thing that pro-Biden folks say is Joe Biden won 14.5 million votes. He won this election. If Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or Josh Shapiro, all these like candidates that the anti-Biden folks would want to have step up, if they'd wanted to challenge Joe Biden, they should have hopped into these primaries and won votes in contrast to him. That'd be a different situation. So that's what the pro-Biden folks say. What the anti-Biden folks say is, if you look at the way the Democratic Party structured these primaries in a bunch of examples. So for example, Florida, there wasn't even technically like a real primary. You had all these examples where like the status quo is set up to favor an incumbent president as opposed to challengers. All that said, the Democratic Party is a private organization. So it's unclear that you could, or we'd be particularly satisfied with Congress passing a law saying you have to do X state Democratic Party of Florida, or you have to do Y Republicans in Nevada, because the Republicans in Nevada like also rigged their primary to a certain degree when it came to Trump. So talk about like the private versus public nature there, because I just love you summing up all of these issues as being downstream from representation. And in the cases with the primaries in both parties, that's clearly a representation issue, but it's private representation as opposed to purely public representation. That's another tension point. So I'd love to hear your general thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both sides of the argument in this Biden democracy debate are missing the actual question here, which is, why do we have political parties? Like, what are they for? Right? And the answer, at least cross-nationally, is not that they're an extension of government, right? Government in a democracy has to be representative. That's what it means to be a democracy. Political parties don't, though, right? Like their goal is to organize a faction of people to present a clear choice to the public. And then for the public to, in an election, determine whether or not they want to accept what is on offer from that institution, right? That's their job. Right, is to sort of create vehicles for for a particular perspective to be expressed. In the American political system, we've kind of blurred that line because we only have two parties, right? We've set up this system where it seems like the parties are supposed to reflect public will, right, in the way that really only publicly held elections are supposed to do, because once the election is set, it's a choice between two candidates, pretty much. It's just a binary person X versus person Y. And regardless of the sort of gradations or specificity of your own positions, the places where you may agree or disagree with those candidates, you have to pick, right? And so the idea behind the primary system as currently set up, at least the way that people sort of think about it, is, well, that's the people determining what their choices are going to be, and then they get to make them at a later date. But that's not how it works, right? If you look at the specifics of the system, that's not even close to how it works.
I'm in Texas, so I'm very specifically an example. 4% of the Republican Party's primary voters determine basically the slate of candidates that dominate the state.
Right, so it's crazy. It's crazy, right? It's just a system for giving a certain small set of people outsized voice over everybody else. So that means there's nothing really truly democratic about the current system, right? The current primary system. It's not an authentic representation of popular will. It's a representation, as you say, of a tiny percentage of the people in the particular place. So replacing Joe Biden isn't like a sin against democracy, right? It's the party making a choice that it has provided a bad candidate based on its own values and the kind of choice it wants to offer the American people in the general election. And it can change the mechanism by which it selects that candidate. And there's nothing undemocratic about that. Nothing undemocratic about that. It would be undemocratic if, let's say Congress decided Trump wins the 2024 election, then Congress is like, nah, we don't really want President Trump. We're going to have President, I don't know, like caretaker George Clooney, who seems to be the real power wielder now in the Democratic Party. That would be undemocratic, right? That would be very undemocratic. But if at the Democratic Convention, the party's elites decide to select their candidate in a different faction, that's why we had conventions in the first place. Like prior to the really modern era, like the past 50 years or so, that's what conventions were for. We've forgotten that. We've forgotten what parties are for and started to see them as semi-public parts of the electoral system. But that really isn't what they're about. And it's not what they're about in other countries, in almost any other country. And we should start rethinking the way that we operate here too.
Give some examples of other countries, even within the study you're doing in the book, of what are other countries that have different conceptions of political parties that you think are optimal, or at least something that the US could take lessons from?
So all systems have downsides, right? I'll start here, right? Like the British election recently is a good example of a system that's a little bit different from ours. It's parliamentary, but it also has huge downsides because, like us, they have first past the post districts where whoever wins a plurality in a particular place ends up winning. And so the result is that Labour won something like 39% of the vote nationally in the UK, and they ended up winning over 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. And they did that and so the Reform Party, which is the far right party, they won somewhere in the neighborhood of 10%. These numbers are rough, right? But they ended up getting only 4 seats out of several hundred in parliament because their votes were spread across the country. Whereas the Liberal Democrats, who won something similar to what the Reform won, they did so and got 72 seats, right? Despite a similar national percentage. Like, yeah, it's not a great system, right? But in terms of the way the general vote shares are allocated. What I like about the UK system, not one of the examples in my book, I think the UK actually has despite all of the criticism it gets, a relatively healthy democratic system in a lot of ways, at a baseline level anyway, is that the parties then end up making choices about their leadership, right? And this is determined partly by the vote of the membership, but it's also determined by different interests inside the party. Labour appropriately gives organized labor significant weight in making determinations about who the candidate's going to be. It's a semi-elite, semi-public system for picking leaders, right? Party leadership and selecting who should be atop the slate and why. And that's an example of the party serving not just like as an extension of the public will, but as a means of organizing a particular faction's ideology and sense of what it stands for. That's one good example. A very different example comes in Israel, which is so fragmented because it's just pure proportional representation where like you get exactly the number of seats corresponding to the share of your national vote. They have like a billion different little parties, right? And those little parties often wield outsized weight in determining how these things are supposed to happen. But a lot of the party level selection, right? The determination of what each of those parties stand for is done by the party leadership, right? And in sort of through internal mechanisms of determining who's going to be at the head of each party. And those are two very different systems, the UK and Israel, right, in terms of how they work in the actual general election. But what they share is that parties in their systems end up standing for very distinct ideological positions and very distinct sets of policy positions. And that offer voters, even like, people complain about the UK duopoly, but you have Reform, you have the Greens, you have the Liberal Democrats. It's much more diverse than the American system, even if there are only two major parties. Right, there are lots of minor parties who do matter. The Scottish National Party is another example, and the American system is just not designed for multi-party democracy, and that partially creates this weird confusion about what our two main political parties are for. So, even in countries that have radically diverse political systems, the role of the parties is clearer and more well understood by the public and better tuned towards providing authentic representation than what we have here.
I think this really brings together the point you made earlier about democratic language is just so hegemonic now that everyone has to utilize it, but our utilization of democratic language obscures the reality of what a political party is supposed to do. I feel as if let's say I'm a DNC party boss type person, the honest response to the Joe Biden won 14.5 million votes is that like, hey, just so you know, the technical purpose of the Democratic National Convention is not to say who won more votes literally. If we're just trying to understand the purpose of a political party, the purpose of the Democratic National Convention is to select the person who can best represent and advance the ideals and priorities of this broad coalition that is the Democratic Party, which means that voters are a part of this, but honestly, like you said, there's labor, they're the organization, they're the donors. And then instead we're stuck in this kind of weird system where George Clooney's opinion really, really, really matters clearly. And I didn't like how people were sort of like, I think, over dunking on the op-ed, because I think his specific citing of like how Biden performed at the actual fundraiser was like, I think the key piece that people kind of missed beyond just George Clooney saying it. Like there was a very nuanced way, but we're still just stuck in this weird in between where we're saying this is purely democratic, but it's like, no, like George Clooney's opinion, George Clooney is actually the leader of a faction of the Democratic Party. Clearly, the Hollywood, California style thing. And honestly, and this is where you had super delegates come in, right? Like, under the previous system, you had a system where like you did have representation for folks like that. So it's just very interesting. So let's take a step back and look at the broader international scene. So you and I are around the same age. We're both children of the 1990s. And if you were to sort of like wake up in 1997, after the Bill Clinton victory, after you watched the Macarena, I love like the Macarena, whenever you see like the 1996 Democratic National Convention, everyone's doing the Macarena and Hillary's joyfully clapping. That was like super
man,
fun.
I hope your producers can cut that in right here.
Yeah, no,
really
this is Phil. This is a no, Phil. This is a no for you. We need to cut that in because it's a very specific moment that aging millennials really need to cherish when we look back at our childhoods.
I am not trying to seduce you. When I dance, they call me Magarena, and the boys they say que soy buena. They all want me, they can't have me, so they all come and dance beside me.
But if you were to look at that period, you've got Blair in the United Kingdom, you have the Germans, obviously. There is this sense that like center-left third wayism, democratic liberalism, not just like at the end of the history, but just sort of like this is the way things are moving. Obviously, 20, 30 years later, we're in an entirely different trajectory. So can you both, A, explain the reactionary nature of our political moment, and then tie that into how much the pendulum has swung away from basically our childhood and a lot of the childhoods of our listeners?
Yeah, it's a fascinating double move that I think has its roots in a misunderstanding of what happened at the end of the 20th century. Right, like a lot of that era gets reduced to the rise of as you say, sort of center-left neoliberalism, however you want to use that term. I know it's contested, but sort of the rise of a more market-friendly vision of what it means to be on the left. But what was also happening at that time, really the influence of earlier movements, was a profound redefinition of what citizenship meant in a democracy. And it was a working out of the contradictions that had bedeviled democracy since its beginning, right? This profession of a society where people make their own choices and leadership as a unit of equals, right? As people cooperating together to rule themselves. And the reality of profound social hierarchies setting the tone and setting the rules of who gets to count as an equal. Right. You know, we often hear this expressed as the Declaration of Independence saying all men are created equal. And then everyone's first reaction nowadays is, really? What about slaves and what about women? Right. And it's so obvious that that means that there's a contradiction in that opening line to us now, that it illustrates that something profound has changed in the way that people think about inclusion in democracy and what the word all means in a democracy. And that was the product of struggle. Right, of decades of fighting inside democracy. At the same time that democracy was fighting its external enemies, monarchy, fascism, communism, democracy was also working out its own contradictions internally. And, you know, by the later years of the 20th century, it became clear that at least in public-facing terms, I want to be clear on this, in the language that dominated the way that people talked and what was really acceptable to articulate in public, the egalitarian side had won. The terms of the conversation had been shifted such that outwardly saying these kinds of people should not be allowed to vote, or these kind of people can't hold office, or these kind of people deserve second-class rights, that, at least in advanced democratic societies, that vision had been pushed to the margins. And you can see this in all sorts of different ways, and we can get into different cross-national examples of it happening. And it happened at different times in different places, but you can say pretty clearly by, you know, the mid-90s that had become the consensus across the democratic world. And that, I think, set the stage for two twinned developments, right? The two that you articulated. The first is reaction. Right, I call my book's called The Reactionary Spirit, right? Because I argue that democracy has always been bedeviled by this tension inside of the conservative half of any democratic society, in which people who support, at least to a degree, the existing social structure are like, well, okay, what if we lose at the ballot box? And some of them say, well, if we lose, we lose. That's the nature of democracy. What we can do is try to win as much as we can and preserve the parts of the system that we think are really valuable and accede to social change in other areas. And that's just the society that we live in. We accept democracy. That's the nature of it. Right. And then there's another choice where you say, well, no, if we lose, something wrong has happened, something profoundly illegitimate, something too dangerous to be allowed to take place is taking place. And if we need to overthrow democracy itself to do that, so be it. And that's what started to happen, right? These challenges to existing social hierarchies were so profound by the dawn of the 21st century, that reactionary movements were starting to gain steam. Reactionary in this defined as the sense of people who make the latter half of that choice that I just offered, right? And those movements started to gain steam across the world in different places at different times, but all of it was a reaction that was structured in a reaction to, right, the grand ideological shift that played out across the advanced democratic world. And that shift also produced a challenge to what seemed like its co-traveler, neoliberalism, because it raised questions about the distribution of wealth that followed from that. And so you end up getting, while both the rise of what people call pejoratively economic populism, pejoratively identity politics, and the rise of left-wing economic populism to a degree as reactions to the failed promise, right, of egalitarian politics or egalitarian ideas that had come to dominate policymaking and political discourse in the latter half of the 20th century. So hence the dual movement of both the center left back to the left and the right towards political reaction.
Could you help me understand a couple of things? So we'll do one at a time. Number one, can you give an example of how the right specifically reacted, the reactionary part of the right reacted against, let's say, the citizenship level of this issue in the 21st century? Because like all sorts of critiques could be offered of the Tea Party and Trump and January 6th and election denial. But I don't recall any calls within, like, let's say, the worst version of Trumpism for, look, we really need to start disenfranchising voters themselves. Obviously, you have like the voter ID issue, which gets like a little complicated. But even within the voter ID issue, actually, a couple of representatives were a little too articulate about this in terms of saying, well, look, like we think that, minority voters don't have voter ID. But like at a broad level, at a movement level, that wasn't actually an argument saying we went too far of expanding democratic rights. Let's just get rid of it. And frankly, even when they did make the minority argument, it was more about like economic policy arguments. It's like, oh, like minorities take all this welfare and they vote too much. So help me kind of understand like the specific ways this dynamic implemented itself in the articulations and the programs of the reactionary right in the US. Sure. And then you could, because I think the international examples of that are probably a little stronger.
Yeah, look, this gets back to your first question. Right, which is, why is it that it seems like Trump is winning with voters who say that they care about democracy in certain places? Right, it's because the language of democracy as itself remained hegemonic. This is what's different between our period and previous periods of political reaction, is that now everybody's playing within the democratic game, right? They're not frontally attacking the principles that triumphed in the 20th century. So they need to both subvert democracy and play within its rhetorical bounds. So you wouldn't expect people to be saying the kind of like, the sort of outright fascist, we got to get rid of the ballot box. But I'll give you a specific example, which is the reaction to Barack Obama's election in 2008, right? The data that we have since then showed a really profound shift in the way that people thought about politics after Obama was elected, right? In a way that singular political developments very rarely do. So, for example, there's this great book by a political scientist named Michael Tesler called Post-Racial or Most Racial. And what Tesler shows is that after Obama becomes president, after he wins the presidency, people's evaluation of all sorts of different political topics on which they used to have kind of like vague or fluid or maybe responsive to events views became directly tied to the identity of the president. Like their evaluation of the economy, for example, became polarized along partisan lines in a way, and racial lines, in a way that it wasn't prior to Barack Obama's election. And there's a bunch of other research that cashes that out in terms of people being very, disturbed isn't quite the right word, maybe unsettled by Barack Obama as the figurehead of an America changing, right? A black man in the presidency really altered the way that a lot of people felt about the social structure of the United States. It showed that something was very different to them. And you can see that on an institutional level as well, right? 2010. Sorry to quote all this research, but it's really important.
It's your day job, so please do so.
Me making stuff up, right? There's another political scientist named Jake Grumbach who has developed a way of assessing how democratic different state governments are, right? And what his research shows We can get to the specifics of how it works if you want, but it shows that 2010, the first election year after Obama was elected, saw a huge dip in the democratic quality of state governments in the United States. And he found that it is concentrated specifically in Republican states, largely explicable by an embrace of gerrymandering, of an extreme gerrymandering that had not been seen in the United States at this level and to this degree in a coordinated fashion in quite some time. And that happened at a coordinated level, right? By the National Republican Party through something called Project Red Map, which was a gerrymandering project that was designed to provide resources to allow different state governments to redraw political lines in ways that were explicitly designed to disenfranchise Democratic voters. So what we have in the immediate wake of Obama's election is a massive shift in public opinion towards a reactionary, unsettled direction, a response, a fear about what had happened to America in racial terms, corresponding with a policy level shift that caused undemocratic institutions to proliferate around Republican controlled states. And now at that time, before people were warning about the death of democracy or whatever, you were, I think rightly now to be concerned about that, you were seeing the seeds of a distrust in the will of the voters and a willingness to go to political extremes to block the political power of progressive coalition that you hadn't seen in the Republican Party prior to that.
So in these last 10 minutes or so, I want to just not rapid fire, but get your answers on a couple questions. So number one, let's say you are the type of center-left voter, institution, individual who thinks very much about this topic. What should you be willing to, or what are you going to have to be willing to concede to the right in order to make basically still have there be something like a center? So for example, voter ID is just going to happen. Maybe immigration levels aren't going to be the immigration, because we could do a whole other episode on immigration, because immigration is the real X factor here at a cross-national level, transnational level. There's a lot of talk about how the center left in Denmark, they survived in contrast to center left in the rest of the continent by becoming very anti-immigration in a way that wasn't particularly normal. So
I think that's a misreading of the Danish case, but we don't need to get into it.
No, please. Can you give me, you're hearing where I'm hearing the CW of this. Do you have a 30-second, what should listeners know about the Danish case?
Yeah, I mean, it is true that Denmark is much more, the center in Denmark is much more hostile to immigration than in other places. But it's also true that in the election where they allegedly proved, the Danish center left allegedly proved that this was the winning formula. What happened was they ended up building a coalition where a lot of the gains were made by pro-immigration third parties or other factions. So it's not that they won on the basis of the center left, the main center left party won on the basis of anti-immigration rhetoric. It's that they their coalition partners did better at the expense of right-wing parties, and their coalition partners, like Green parties, that were relatively, by Danish standards, pro-immigration. So it's not, I don't think that example shows what people say it shows. But I do want to sort of get to the main question that you were asking, which is what do you have to cede to the right? And I think immigration is a good example here. I have very, very, very loose views on immigration in the sense that I think levels should be a lot higher than they are, right? But that's something that should be decided through the democratic process. Right. It's not something that I believe I can say as a matter of moral, liberal, democratic principle that people who disagree with me should be banned from participating in the electoral system, or that my policies should be mandated via some kind of constitutional fiat. Right. That's part of the give and take of the democratic system. And so I write in the book that there are a lot of European far right parties, or what we call far right parties, that take truly extreme views on immigration, at least from my point of view. But that's not grounds in and of themselves to label them anti-democratic. They need to be able to pursue their vision of politics through the democratic system. And I, as a left-wing person, can argue against their policy ideas. I can I don't donate to political candidates, but I could, hypothetically, in this world, that would be a legitimate form of activity, right? Go to protests, whatever, but not bar them on grounds that they're a threat to democracy, unless they are. Right. And some of them do cross that line. The AfD in Germany is very clearly at this point an anti-democratic faction. So too is Fidesz in Hungary. Right. And they're the ruling party. The AfD is not. So what to do about a far-right party that crosses the line into something, beyond acceptable criticisms of immigration, well, that's a separate kind of question. But there have to be room for right-wing views, even ones that I profoundly disagree with or that challenge the basis of a lot of liberal political ideals inside the democratic system.
Something I'm fascinated by, if Joe Biden loses, let's say he retains his candidacy and he loses to Trump in a convincing way. I'm fascinated by how we are going to look back at the New York City Trump case, and then of course the Colorado Secretary of State attempting to get Trump off of the ballot. I think that's good. There's going to be a couple. There aren't going to be many. Like you and I both know there's going to be this huge did Joe Biden go too post neoliberal? Did he embrace the squad too much? Did Elizabeth Warren, did she staff too much? There's going to be all those debates. I don't think any one side is going to be able to come to some sort of concerted answer. A place though where I do think a Biden loss will result in, I think, pretty decisive takes on either side would be the tensions presented by trying to take Trump off of the ballot or lead to criminal prosecution. How would you think about those areas both now and after, let's say, Trump convincingly wins?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're separate issues, right? The criminal conviction and the kicked off the ballot issue. And I think it's worth taking them separately, right? The issue with the ballot removal effort, and I think the Supreme Court, there's a reason that was a 9-0 case.
Yeah.
Right? It's that the Supreme Court rightly determined that the reading of the law that allowed basically anybody to take Trump off the ballot would have been a recipe for electoral chaos.
Forever.
Right? Forever.
It would actually fundamentally damage democracy to take that to its logical conclusion.
Yeah. Look, I think there was a very compelling argument that Donald Trump violated the rules set out in the 14th Amendment about insurrection. I think that argument's very strong. I think the weak point in the case, and I wrote this right at the time when the case was first emerging, the weak point in the argument and the thing that makes it unlikely to ever be implemented is that the theory for who should be enforcing it, right, is lacking.
We have an impeachment process.
Right, and,
there's a system outside of individual state officials.
Yeah, and maybe the Supreme Court should have taken that role on itself, but the fact is it didn't, and it didn't for very good reasons. Trump's trials, I think, are a different matter because while there was unsettled legitimacy towards what authority should be making determinations about ballot access with respect to the 14th Amendment, there is very clear, black letter law about who is going to be making determinations about whether someone committed a crime. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think Trump needed to stand trial for that. I think that the recent Supreme Court ruling on immunity is horrendous, right? That if he committed crimes, which, a jury of his peers said that he did, right, then he needs to stand trial for it. And that is true even if he's running for president, right? Another thing that you can see in cross-national comparisons is that political elites and chief executives are often tried for crimes, often even when they're in office. Israel's prime minister is on trial right now in the middle of the country's worst crisis in its history.
A previous Israeli prime minister was jailed.
Right. And Israel is a country with a very damaged democracy, right? They're one of my case studies in the book for a country that's having a real crisis of democracy and is teetering on the brink of autocracy. But this is one of the examples where their system is holding, right? Their system's working the way it's supposed to be by trying Benjamin Netanyahu. And that our system is having difficulty trying Trump is a damning indictment, I think, of our democratic institutions, one that's separate from your evaluations of Trump, right? If Biden's committed crimes, try Biden too, right? I don't think he has. This is just a factual determination, right? The efforts to establish that have been extremely weak through congressional investigation, but there's nothing wrong in principle with doing said investigations as long as it leads to a process, a fair criminal process. And I think that we're seeing through the cases that have been risen that there actually is a legal system that works in a lot of ways. It's just that there are certain determinations coming from the top right now that are preventing it from working.
So for the last question, this isn't like a policy book per se, so there's not going to be so Zack, you just give me the 10 things we need to do to fix everything. It would seem to me, though, the takeaway from this conversation, though, is that if one is seeking to move past this reactionary moment, because my critique of reactionary moments beyond just the specifics is that I don't think they produce anything. I think they're not only unsustainable at a political level, but I actually do not think they produce what they are supposed to produce. When it comes to diagnosis, I don't think reactionary systems can solve the problems that they rightfully identify in certain cases. America is not, let's say Trump wins and goes hard on the paint on immigration. We're not going to resolve our 30-year immigration impasse via those means. So my answer, given what you said here, is that representation, like highlighting representation as like the source of all of these issues would be a takeaway. But how would you close the interview and like offer your book as a reading for understanding what we've talked about?
Yeah. Like, I think there are two things, right? First, in my sort of Solutions E chapter is that I argue that we need to understand democracy through a broader lens, by which people often talk about. The concept I use here is John Rawls's notion of an overlapping consensus, which is just like whatever your specific views or worldview is, or specific policy views or general worldview is, you can agree on certain essential principles of democracy, right? And that understanding the purpose of political cooperation as being people who agree on those principles, working out amongst themselves and respecting each other, even if they disagree, and respecting the outcomes of systems that may not be the outcome they wanted, but as long as they adhere to the general, with it and play within the lines of an acceptable democratic settlement, then we can all have a debate around those principles. And I mean, it gets more complicated than that in the implementation, but I think that's like, we have to start by seeing the places in which people who may radically disagree on policy substance agree at a basic level on democratic principles. Mm-hmm. And then from there, we need to move on to, okay, what are the implications of that for specific political questions? And to me, like the answer to that second thing is also itself twofold, right? The first is that creates an organizing principle for movements against politicians and political movements that do authentically threaten democracy, like Germany's AfD. Right, you end up getting a cross-ideological alliance of Germans in that country specifically, protesting its actions and cooperating, in mass rallies through their political parties to try to block it from wielding power. I mean, that's part of the story of what happened in the French elections was the left and the center agreeing to work together because they believe the far right to be a threat to the most basic values of their system. Agree or disagree with their determination, I like the spirit of it. Mm-hmm. Right. I like the idea that's happening here. And I like the way that it seemingly mobilized voters to get out and participate and take actions and vote, go vote on the basis of their commitment to democracy. And that to me should give us some hope, right? And some advice to political parties about what to do. And the second component is like, we need to have serious conversations as a country about dealing with the representation crisis through the spirit of shared democratic cooperation. Like a lot of constitutional reform conversations end up boiling down to Democrats want the thing that's good for Democrats and Republicans want the thing that's good for Republicans.
Yeah, this is why like admitting Puerto Rico and DC as, states, et cetera, may have its validity from a like philosophical argumentative perspective, but it's ultimately seen through the lens of ensuring Democrats can pass legislation, which isn't going to be a starting point of any like broad reform within the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a travesty. I live in DC right now, and it sucks not to be able to have a senator. It sucks not to have a Congress member, right? That's really, it is undemocratic to me, right, as a DC resident, but I'm not going to get anywhere in demanding DC statehood so long as the conversation that surrounds it is breaking down on purely partisan lines. And I understand that. And maybe Democrats could have done something when they had a trifecta early in the Biden years, but they didn't. And so now the point is moot. They'd be on very firm, small d Democratic ground in doing so. But yeah, there needs to be some kind of mechanism for figuring out a broad democratic reform process, a move to something like proportional representation that's not just, this is going to allow Democrats to win forever. This is going to allow Republicans to win forever. It's just the system's so polarized in the United States that it's hard to imagine that happening. So that's the depressing note I want to leave you on. Yeah. Is like, that part of it's totally screwed and I don't have a good solution, which is why I didn't try to present one in the book. But the first part of it, you can organize political coalitions around democratic values and commitment to said democratic values. That I think is something that's really actionable. And the book has some very specific ways as to how one can go about doing that.
Excellent. Zack, the book is The Reactionary Spirit, How America's Most Insidious Political Traditions Swept the World. Thank you for joining me on the Realignment.
Oh, it's great. I love this conversation. Thanks, Marshall.